My son-in-law invited everyone on a family vacation except me. He looked me in the eye and said we only have enough money for tickets for us and my parents. My daughter added that they needed a break from me because I would not fit in at a luxury resort. I just smiled and said, "Okay, enjoy your vacation." When they checked into the hotel, I was already there. I was not there as a guest. I was there as the owner. I am Reginald King. I am 71 years old. Most people look at me and see a retired maintenance worker. I wear polo shirts that I bought 5 years ago. My sneakers have scuff marks on the toes. I take the bus because I prefer to watch the city move rather than sit in traffic behind the wheel of a luxury car. My own daughter Nia believes I live on a meager pension and Social Security. She believes the small apartment I invite her to is my only home. She does not know about the penthouse uptown. She does not know about the diversified portfolio. She certainly does not know that King Hospitality owns 15 five-star resorts across the United States. I kept my wealth hidden to teach her the value of $1. I wanted her to build her own character. It seems I failed. Last Sunday started like any other. I took the crosstown bus to Nia's house for our weekly dinner. The house is a 4-bedroom colonial in a gated community. I paid the down payment for it 6 years ago, though Nia tells her husband Blake that it was a bonus from her work. Blake is a 35-year-old marketing director. He drives a leased BMW and wears watches that cost more than my first car. He talks loud and laughs louder. He treats me with a tolerance one reserves for a slow-witted pet. I sat at the corner of their mahogany dining table. The room smelled of roasted lamb and expensive perfume. Blake's parents were there, Preston and Georgette. They are people who believe wealth is a volume knob. They speak loudly about their country club memberships and the price of their imported cars. Preston looked at my faded blue shirt and smirked. He asked if I had found any good sales at the thrift store lately. I ignored him and took a sip of water. I have learned that silence is the most expensive thing you can buy. Blake stood up and tapped his fork against his crystal wine glass. The sound rang through the room. He cleared his throat. He had a smile that looked like he had just gotten away with a crime. He announced that next week was their 5th wedding anniversary. He said they were going to celebrate in style. He said they were going to Miami for 10 days. Nia clapped her hands. She looked beautiful. She is a dermatologist, but she works part-time now because Blake insists he can provide. I know the truth about their finances, but I have never spoken a word. Blake continued his speech. He said he had booked flights on American Airlines, first class. He said he had reserved rooms at the Royal Palms Resort and Spa. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. The Royal Palms. That was the jewel of my collection. I bought that property 20 years ago when it was a failing hotel called the Sand Dollar. I poured $40 million into renovations. It is now the most exclusive resort in South Beach. Blake looked at his parents. He told Preston and Georgette that he had booked them the presidential suite as a thank you for being such supportive in-laws. Georgette squealed like a teenager. She showed off her manicured nails and said she needed to go shopping for new bikinis. Preston patted Blake on the back and said he was a good son. The room was full of joy and anticipation. I waited. I waited for someone to look at me. I waited for my name. I waited for my daughter to say something. The silence stretched. It became heavy and suffocating. I finally placed my fork down on the china plate. I asked a simple question. I asked what time I should have my suitcase ready. The laughter died instantly. It was as if I had sucked the oxygen out of the room. Blake looked at Nia. Nia looked at her plate. Preston coughed into his napkin. Georgette took a long sip of her wine. Blake put on his serious face. It was the face he used when he tried to explain why he missed a credit card payment. He said that actually they had not calculated me into the budget. He said the tickets were very expensive. He said the resort was $500 a night. He said they had stretched their finances to the limit to bring his parents. I looked at Nia. I expected her to speak up. I expected her to say that I was her father. I expected her to say that if there was no money for me, then they would downgrade their rooms to make it work. She did not. She looked at Blake and then she looked at me with eyes full of pity. She said that Blake was right. She said that the budget was tight. Then she delivered the second blow. She said that honestly I would not enjoy it. She said the Royal Palms is a place for high society. She said there are dress codes for dinner. She said I would feel out of place among those people. She said I would be uncomfortable and lonely. She said they needed a break to relax with people who understood their lifestyle. She meant Preston and Georgette. She meant people who were white. She meant people who looked like they belonged. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. It was not anger. Anger is hot. This was disappointment. It was the freezing realization that my daughter was ashamed of me. She saw a poor old black man in worn clothes. She did not see the father who worked double shifts to put her through medical school. She did not see the man who secretly paid off her student loans the day she graduated. She saw a burden. Blake poured more wine for his father. It was a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon that cost $200. I knew the price because I own the vineyard that produces it. He said maybe next time they could do something simpler, maybe a camping trip, something more my speed. Preston laughed. He said camping was perfect for people who were used to roughing it. I looked around the table. I saw the expensive furniture I had paid for. I saw the food I had bought. I saw the people who were living on my hidden generosity while treating me like a beggar. I made a decision in that second. The game was over. I stood up slowly. My knees cracked. I put on my best smile. It was the smile I used before I fired a corrupt executive. I told them it was okay. I told them I understood perfectly. I told them to enjoy their vacation. I told them everyone deserves exactly what they pay for. I reached into my pocket. I had brought an envelope with $5,000 in cash. I had intended to give it to them as a surprise gift for their anniversary. I felt the thickness of the envelope. I pulled my hand out empty. I left the envelope in my pocket. I walked to the front door. Nia called out half-heartedly. She asked if I wanted to take some leftovers home. She said there was plenty of lamb. I did not turn around. I said I had plenty to eat at home. I walked out of the gated community. I walked past the security guard who waved at me. He knew me as the nice old man who walked to the bus stop. I stood under the street lamp. The Miami flight was tomorrow morning. They would be waking up early to drive to the airport. They would be posting photos on social media of their first-class lounge access. I took out my phone. It was not the cheap flip phone I carried when I was with them. It was a secure satellite smartphone. I dialed a number that only 3 people in the world possessed. The voice on the other end answered on the first ring. I spoke clearly. I said I needed the Gulfstream G650 fueled and ready at the private hangar in 2 hours. I said I was going to Miami. I said I needed the penthouse at the Royal Palms prepped for my arrival. The assistant asked if I wanted the usual security protocol. I said no. I said I wanted the general manager informed that I was coming, but the staff was to treat me as a ghost until I gave the signal. I said I wanted a full financial report on Blake and Nia sent to my tablet before I landed. I hung up the phone. The city bus pulled up to the curb. It hissed as the doors opened. I stepped onto the bus and swiped my senior citizen discount card. I sat in the back. I watched the houses of the wealthy suburb fade away. They thought they were leaving me behind. They thought they were going to a paradise where they could pretend to be royalty. They were wrong. They were walking straight into my kingdom. And in my kingdom there is no room for liars. I looked at my reflection in the dark bus window. The tired old man was gone. Reginald King, the CEO, was back. I took the envelope of cash out of my pocket. I looked at it. $5,000. It was not enough to buy a lesson, but it was enough to tip the pilot. I closed my eyes and waited for the ride to end. The vacation was just beginning. The hum of the Gulfstream engines was a whisper against the silence of the cabin. I sat in the cream leather seat and looked down at the clouds covering the Atlantic Ocean. I held a glass of sparkling water in my hand. I do not drink alcohol when I am preparing for a battle. And make no mistake, this was a battle. On the tablet in front of me was a file sent by my head of risk management. It was a financial autopsy of my son-in-law Blake. I expected it to be bad. I did not expect it to be a crime scene. I swiped through the pages. The numbers were in stark red. Blake was not just poor, he was drowning. He had $85,000 in credit card debt. It was not debt from student loans or a mortgage. It was debt from stupidity. There were charges for online sports betting sites. There were payments for a leased BMW that cost more than a teacher's salary. There were dinners at steakhouses where he tipped 50% to look successful while his bank account was overdrawn. He was living a lie and he was financing it with high-interest loans. I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. This man looked down on me. He treated me like a charity case because I wore old shoes. Yet he was the one living on borrowed time. But the next page was the one that made me set my glass down hard on the table. It was the transaction log for the vacation. I saw the charge for American Airlines, 4 first-class tickets. I saw the charge for the deposit at the Royal Palms, $5,000. The total estimated cost of the trip was $20,000. The payment source was a Visa card ending in 4598. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a small notebook where I keep my account codes. I verified the number. It was my card. 5 years ago, I gave a supplementary credit card to my daughter, Naya. I told her it was for emergencies. I told her to use it if she or the children ever needed medicine or urgent medical care. I told her it was a safety net. Nia had taken that safety net and used it to strangle me. She had paid for a luxury vacation to exclude me using my own money. She was treating her husband and his arrogant parents to a presidential suite on my dime while telling me they had a limited budget. I closed my eyes. I did not feel sadness. Sadness is a luxury for people who can afford to be weak. I felt clarity. Nia was no longer the innocent girl I protected. She was a 32-year-old woman who chose to steal from her father to please a husband who was a fraud. She had made her choice. Now she would have to live with the consequences. The pilot announced we were beginning our descent into Miami. I looked out the window. The water was turquoise and clear. In the distance, I saw the white towers of the Royal Palms Resort and Spa. It stood like a fortress on the edge of the beach. To the world, it is a 5-star paradise. To me, it is a monument to my past. 40 years ago, I stood on the roof of that very building. I was not flying in a private jet then. I was 31 years old. I was wearing a gray uniform that smelled of bleach and sweat. I was a janitor. I cleaned the marble floors of the lobby until my knees were bruised. I unclogged the toilets of men like Preston and Blake. I was invisible. I remembered the day I left. It was a Tuesday in July. The heat was suffocating. A wealthy guest accused me of stealing a gold watch from his room. I had not taken it. I had never taken a penny that was not mine. The general manager did not ask for proof. He did not look at the security cameras. He looked at my skin and he looked at my uniform. He fired me on the spot. He told me to get off the property before he called the police. He withheld my final paycheck to cover the cost of the watch. I walked out the service entrance with nothing but the shirt on my back and a fire in my gut. I swore then that I would return. I swore I would not just be a guest. I worked 3 jobs. I saved. I invested in real estate when the market crashed. 10 years later, the hotel went bankrupt. I bought it for cash. I framed the termination letter from that manager and hung it in my private office. It reminds me that dignity is not given. It is taken. Now my daughter and her husband were coming to my hotel. They were coming to act like royalty. They were coming to look down on the staff just as those guests had looked down on me 40 years ago. They did not know they were walking into a trap. They did not know that the man they pushed aside held the keys to the kingdom. I picked up the secure satellite phone on the console. I dialed the number of Javier, the general manager of the Royal Palms. He answered on the first ring. His voice was professional and alert. He knew that a call from this number meant business. I spoke calmly. I told him I was landing in 20 minutes. I told him I wanted the private elevator to the penthouse unlocked. Then I gave him the instructions regarding the reservation for Blake and Nia. Javier asked if he should prepare the VIP welcome package with the champagne and the flowers. I said no. I told him to flag their reservation in the system. I told him that when they arrive tomorrow, they are to be treated exactly according to their financial standing. I told him to run a credit check on every card they present. I told him that if a card is declined, there are to be no exceptions, no courtesies, no waivers. I told him to check the status of the presidential suite. He confirmed it was reserved for them. I told him to cancel it. I told him to mark it as unavailable due to a maintenance issue. I told him to downgrade them to the standard rooms on the first floor near the loading dock. Javier hesitated. He asked if I was sure. He knew they were my family. I looked at the tablet screen again. I looked at the debt. I looked at the stolen money. I said I had never been more sure of anything in my life. I told him to prepare a welcome they would never forget. I told him that the Bank of Dad was officially closed. The landing gear locked into place with a heavy thud. The plane banked left. I watched the shadow of the jet race across the water. Tomorrow the show would begin. I would be watching from the front row, and this time I would not be the one leaving through the service entrance. The lobby of the Royal Palms is a cathedral of excess designed to make ordinary men feel small. The ceilings soar 30 feet high, holding up crystal chandeliers that cost more than most houses. The floors are paved with Italian marble so polished it reflects the guests like a frozen lake. The air is perfumed with the scent of white tea and orchids. It is a place where silence is a commodity, and every surface screams money. I sat in a velvet wingback chair near the main entrance. I was the only stain on this pristine picture. I wore a faded Hawaiian shirt with a pattern of coconuts that I bought at a garage sale for $3. My khaki shorts had a small tear near the hem, and the elastic was worn. On my feet were rubber sandals worn with gray socks. To the staff who had been briefed, I was the eccentric owner conducting a quality control test. To the guests passing by, I was an eyesore. I was a confused old man who had wandered in off the street to steal the air conditioning. I watched the automatic glass doors slide open. A stretch black limousine pulled up to the curb. The doorman rushed to open the rear door. Blake stepped out first. He was wearing a cream linen suit that was too tight across the shoulders and sunglasses that covered half his face. He looked like he was auditioning for a movie about drug dealers. Nia followed him. She wore a flowing designer sundress and a wide-brimmed hat. She looked beautiful, but her posture was tense. Then came Preston and Georgette. Preston wore a polo shirt with a designer logo the size of a fist. Georgette was dripping in gold jewelry that clashed violently with the morning sun. They walked into the lobby with their chins raised high. They looked around with an air of ownership that was entirely unearned. Nia saw me first. She stopped so abruptly that Blake bumped into her back. She froze. Her eyes went wide and her face drained of color. She looked like she had seen a ghost. She whispered, "Dad." Her voice was a mix of horror and disbelief. Blake followed her gaze. He took off his sunglasses slowly. His face twisted into a sneer of pure contempt. He looked around quickly to see if anyone important was watching. He grabbed Nia's arm and marched over to me. His leather loafers clicked aggressively on the marble. He stood over me, blocking the light. He asked what the hell I was doing here. His voice was a harsh whisper. He asked if I had followed them. He called me a stalker. He said I was sick. Nia hissed at me. She asked why I could not just let them be. She said I promised I would stay home. She looked at my clothes with absolute disgust. She asked if I had any shame wearing those rags in a 5-star resort. She said I was embarrassing them. She said people were staring. Preston and Georgette caught up to them. Preston let out a bark of a laugh. He looked me up and down like I was a piece of gum on his shoe. He said, "Look at him." He said I looked like I had washed up on the beach with the driftwood. He asked if I was here to apply for a job cleaning the toilets. He said they probably needed someone to scrub the algae off the pool tiles. Georgette wrinkled her nose as if she smelled something rotting. She fanned herself with her hand. She said it smelled like poverty. She told Blake to get rid of me before anyone thought we were together. She said it would ruin their reputation to be seen with a vagrant. I sat perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I looked at my daughter. I waited for her to say that I was her father. I waited for her to tell them to stop. She did not. She crossed her arms and looked away. She was ashamed of me. Blake reached into his pocket. He pulled out his money clip. It was gold. He peeled off a single $20 bill. It was crumpled. He threw it at me. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it like one tosses scraps to a stray dog. The bill fluttered through the air. It landed on the marble floor near my sandaled foot. Blake pointed a finger at me. He said, "Take this." He said, "Go buy yourself a bottle of water and a bus ticket back to wherever I came from." He said, "Do not let me see you in this lobby again, or I will have security throw you out like trash." He said, "This is a place for winners, not for charity cases." The lobby was quiet. A few guests looked over but quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved in a family squabble. The humiliation was complete. They had stripped me of my dignity in the very building I owned. I leaned down slowly. My joints popped loudly in the silence. I picked up the $20 bill from the floor. I smoothed it out on my knee. I folded it neatly in half. I placed it into the front pocket of my Hawaiian shirt. I looked up at Blake. I looked him directly in the eyes. I did not blink. I spoke softly. I said, "Thank you, son." I said, "This money will be very useful." Blake let out a scoff of disbelief. He turned his back on me. He took Nia's arm and pulled her toward the reception desk. Preston and Georgette followed, laughing and shaking their heads. They walked toward the check-in counter where the staff was waiting. They walked with the swagger of people who believe the world owes them everything. I watched them go. I patted the pocket where the $20 sat. It was the last money Blake would ever give me. It was the price of his soul. I watched them approach the marble counter. I saw the receptionist look up. I saw her smile tighten. She had her instructions. The first surprise was waiting, and I had the best seat in the house. I stood behind a large potted palm near the concierge desk. It offered the perfect vantage point. I could see the beads of sweat forming on the back of Blake's neck. He stood at the marble reception counter with his chest puffed out. He leaned casually against the high desk. He looked like a man who owned the place. The irony was delicious. He tapped his fingers on the granite surface. He was impatient. He wanted his key. He wanted his champagne. He wanted the world to acknowledge his arrival. The receptionist was a young woman named Sarah. I hired her 3 years ago. She has a doctorate in hospitality management and a poker face that could bankrupt a casino. She typed on her keyboard. Her face was blank. She looked up at Blake. She asked for a credit card for the incidentals and the room deposit. It was standard procedure. The deposit for the presidential suite was $5,000. Blake laughed. It was a loud, performative sound. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a heavy metal card. It glinted under the chandeliers. I recognized it immediately. It was the supplementary card I had issued to Nia for emergency medical expenses. It was the lifeline I gave my daughter to keep her safe. Blake was using it to buy an ego boost. He slid it across the counter with a flourish. He told Sarah to charge whatever she needed. He told her not to worry about the limit. Sarah inserted the card into the machine. The seconds ticked by. The machine beeped. It was a harsh, dissonant sound that cut through the ambient lobby music. Sarah looked at the screen. She did not flinch. She removed the card and placed it on the counter. She spoke clearly. She said, "I am sorry, sir, but this card has been declined." Blake froze. His smile twitched. He looked at Nia. He looked at his parents. He leaned in closer to Sarah. He lowered his voice, but I could still hear him. He said that was impossible. He said it was a platinum card. He told her to run it again. He said she probably inserted it wrong. He said the chip was sensitive. Sarah nodded politely. She inserted the card again. She waited. The machine beeped again. Declined. She looked at Blake. She said, "The bank has put a hard stop on this card, sir. It has been flagged for suspicious activity." "Do you have another form of payment?" Blake's face turned a shade of red that matched the carpet. He fumbled in his wallet. He pulled out his personal Visa. This was the card with the $85,000 debt. He handed it over. The machine beeped. Declined. He pulled out a MasterCard. Declined. He pulled out a Discover card that looked like it had been through a washing machine. Declined. The line behind them was growing. A wealthy couple in tennis whites sighed loudly. A businessman checked his watch. Blake was sweating profusely now. The illusion of the wealthy executive was crumbling in real time. He looked at Nia. Nia looked at the floor. She knew the cards were maxed out. She knew they were living on fumes. Blake turned to his father. He laughed nervously. He said there must be a system error with the banks back home. He said he would clear it up with a phone call later. He asked Preston if he could cover the deposit just for now. He promised to wire him the money as soon as they got to the room. Preston did not look happy. The smile vanished from his face. He looked at his son with cold calculation. He asked if Blake was serious. He said he thought this trip was a gift. He said he did not fly all this way to pay for his own hotel room. Georgette chimed in. She said this was embarrassing. She said people were watching. Blake pleaded with his eyes. He looked desperate. Preston sighed. He grumbled something about incompetence. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He threw his credit card on the counter. He told Sarah to hurry up. He said they were tired of standing. Sarah processed the deposit on Preston's card. It went through. Blake exhaled. He straightened his jacket. He tried to regain his composure. He smiled at Sarah. He said, "Now that the technical difficulties are over, we are ready for our keys." He said, "Please have the butler take our bags up to the presidential suite immediately." Sarah did not move to make keys. She looked at the screen again. She typed for a moment. She frowned. She looked up at Blake with an expression of professional regret. She said she had some unfortunate news. She said there had been a critical maintenance failure in the presidential suite this morning. She said a pipe had burst. She said the room was flooded. She said it was uninhabitable. Georgette shrieked. She asked what that meant. She asked where they were going to stay. Blake slammed his hand on the counter. He demanded to speak to a manager. He said this was unacceptable. He said he booked that room 6 months ago. Sarah remained calm. She said the hotel was fully booked due to the holiday season. She said she had checked the inventory. She said the only rooms available were 2 standard double rooms. She said they were located on the ground floor in the north wing. I knew the north wing. It was the oldest part of the hotel. It was next to the service entrance and the industrial laundry vents. The view from the ground floor windows was a direct line of sight to the heavy metal dumpsters where the kitchen waste was collected. It was noisy. It smelled of old frying oil. It was the purgatory of the Royal Palms. Blake exploded. He shouted that he was a Diamond member. He shouted that he knew people. He demanded an upgrade. He demanded the penthouse. The general manager stepped out from the back office. He is a large man with a presence that commands silence. He walked up to the counter. He did not smile. He looked at Blake. He said there are no upgrades available. He said the penthouse is occupied by the owner. He said you can take the standard rooms or we can refund your deposit and you can try to find another hotel in Miami on a holiday weekend. He said the choice is yours, but you need to make it now because you are blocking the line. Blake looked at Nia. Nia looked ready to cry. Georgette was fanning herself furiously, claiming she felt faint. Preston looked at the bill he had just paid and realized he was paying $5,000 to sleep next to a dumpster. They had no choice. They had nowhere else to go. Blake snatched the key cards from Sarah's hand. He did not say thank you. He muttered a curse word. He signaled for the bellhop. He told his parents to follow him. He tried to walk away with dignity, but it is hard to look dignified when you have just been publicly demoted. They walked toward the elevators. I stood up from my chair behind the palm. I walked out into the open. I timed my approach perfectly. I intersected their path just as they reached the elevator bank. There are two sets of elevators at the Royal Palms. To the left are the guest elevators. They are nice, but they are slow. To the right is a single elevator door made of brushed gold. It has no buttons on the outside. It only has a card scanner. It is the direct line to the penthouse. Blake saw me. He stopped. His face was a mask of fury. He asked what I was still doing here. He asked if I was following them. He told me to get lost. He pressed the button for the guest elevator aggressively. I did not answer him. I did not look at him. I walked past him. I walked past Nia, who was staring at her shoes. I walked past Preston, who was complaining about the humidity. I walked up to the gold door. I reached into the pocket of my faded Hawaiian shirt. I pulled out a black key card. It had no markings. I held it up to the scanner. The light on the panel turned from red to a brilliant emerald green. The heavy gold doors slid open silently. The interior was lined with velvet and mirrors. I stepped inside. I turned around to face them. The doors began to close. I saw Blake's jaw drop. I saw the confusion in Nia's eyes. I saw Preston squinting as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. They were standing in front of the crowded guest elevator waiting to go down to the basement level. I was standing in a gold box going to the top of the world. I offered them a small, polite nod just before the doors sealed shut. The elevator began to rise. It moved fast. My stomach dropped, but my spirit soared. The first lesson had been delivered. They were confused. They were angry. But they still believed I was just a lucky old man who found a key card. They had no idea that the man in the Hawaiian shirt was the one pulling the strings. Tomorrow morning at breakfast, the real education would begin. The Palm Court restaurant is where the wealthy come to gorge themselves on eggs, Benedict, and self-importance. The air smells of freshly ground Kona coffee and expensive perfume. It is a place of polished silver and hushed conversations. The morning light filters through the high glass ceiling, illuminating the buffet stations that stretch for 50 feet. There are mountains of shrimp on ice. There are chefs carving prime rib. There are fountains of chocolate. It is a display of excess designed to make the guests feel like kings. I sat at a small round table near the swinging kitchen doors. It was the table usually reserved for solo travelers or staff on break. I preferred it. From here I could see the entire room without being seen. I ate dry toast and drank black tea. I watched the choreography of the breakfast service. I watched the waiters navigate the floor with heavy trays. I watched the guests pile their plates high with food they would not finish. Blake and his entourage arrived at 9 o'clock. They looked ragged. The noise from the dumpsters outside their ground floor rooms must have kept them awake. Preston had bags under his eyes. He walked with a limp. Nia looked pale and she kept checking her phone. But Georgette was determined to put on a show. She wore a flowing silk caftan with a loud tropical print. It was the kind of dress that cost $600 but looked like a curtain. She had stacked gold bangles on both arms that clanked together like wind chimes every time she moved. They sat at a large central table. They complained loudly about the coffee. They complained that the orange juice was too pulpy. They complained that the air conditioning was too cold. They treated the waiter with a dismissal that made my blood simmer. I watched them eat. They ate with an aggression that suggested they were trying to get their money worth. They were angry about the rooms. They were angry about the credit cards. They needed a target for their frustration. I stood up to refill my tea. The path to the beverage station was wide. There was plenty of room for two people to pass without touching. I walked slowly. I kept my eyes forward. I did not want a confrontation before I had finished my tea. Georgette saw me. She was standing at the juice station filling a tall glass with fresh orange juice. She saw me approaching. I saw her eyes lock onto me. They narrowed. A spark of malicious opportunity lit up her face. She waited until I was parallel to her. She changed her trajectory. She sped up. It was a calculated collision. She slammed her shoulder into my chest. She held the glass of juice in her right hand. She did not drop it. She flicked her wrist with the precision of a tennis player. It was a move of pure malice. The cold, sticky liquid splashed over my chest. It soaked into my white polo shirt. It dripped down my shorts. It ran down my leg into my sock. "Oh my God, watch where you are going, you clumsy old fool." Her voice was a siren. The restaurant went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Every head turned. Georgette brushed a microscopic drop of juice off her silk sleeve. She looked at me with venom. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. She said, "Look what you did." She said, "This dress is designer silk." She said, "It is ruined." She said, "I should not be allowed in here if I cannot walk without stumbling." She called me a senile hazard. I stood there dripping. The juice was cold against my skin, but I felt a fire rising inside me. I looked at the table where my family sat. Blake was smirking. He was leaning back in his chair enjoying the show. He liked seeing me humbled. He liked seeing me dirty. I looked at Nia, my daughter. The girl I carried on my shoulders when she was too tired to walk. The woman whose tuition I paid with sweat and sleepless nights. She saw exactly what happened. She saw her mother-in-law assault her father. She saw the injustice. I waited for her to stand up. I waited for her to defend me. She did not. She picked up a menu and held it in front of her face. She erased me. She chose her comfort over my dignity. That hurt more than the humiliation. It was the final confirmation that the daughter I raised was gone. The cold juice on my skin triggered a memory I keep locked in a steel box in my heart. It was 40 years ago. My wife was a housekeeper for a family in the wealthy district. She worked for a woman just like Georgette, a woman who believed her husband money made her a goddess. One day, that woman accused my wife of stealing a silver spoon. She made my wife empty her purse on the front lawn while the neighbors watched. She called her trash. She called her a thief. My wife came home that day and she cried until she fell asleep. She was a strong woman, but humiliation has a weight that can crush anyone. That night I held her hand. I looked at her tear-stained face and I made a vow. I swore that no one would ever make us feel small again. I swore I would build a wall of money so high that no one could ever look down on us. I built this empire not for the luxury. I built it for the shield. I bought this hotel so that people like Georgette would have to answer to people like me. The floor manager rushed over with a stack of white napkins. He looked terrified. He knew who I was. He knew I signed his paychecks. He started to dab at my shirt. He apologized profusely. He offered to get me a fresh shirt from the boutique. I stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. I told him no. I did not wipe the stain. I wanted to wear it. It was a badge of honor. It was evidence. It was the fuel I needed to burn their world down. I stepped closer to Georgette. She took a step back. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. She expected an apology. She expected me to cower. She expected the poor old man to be afraid of the rich lady. She did not expect me to invade her personal space. I looked her in the eye. I spoke clearly. My voice was low, but it carried across the room. I wanted the entire buffet line to hear this. I said, "Mrs. Preston, do not worry about my shirt. A stain on fabric is a trivial thing. It can be washed away with water and soap. It is temporary. But there is another kind of stain here." Georgette frowned. She asked what I was talking about. She told me to get away from her. I continued. I said, "A stain on your character is permanent. There is no detergent in the world that can clean a rotten soul. You spilled juice on me to make yourself feel big, but you only showed everyone how small you really are." Georgette turned the color of a beet. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. She gasped. She looked around for support, but the other guests were whispering. They were not looking at her with admiration. They were looking at her with disgust. They saw a dignified man standing up to a bully. I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on her. I walked past the table where Nia was hiding behind her menu. I did not look at her. I walked out of the restaurant with the orange juice dripping from my shirt. I walked with my head high. As I passed the host stand, I caught the eye of the general manager. He was standing by the door, witnessing everything. I gave him a single nod. It was a silent command. It meant proceed with phase 2. It meant take off the gloves. I walked to the elevator. The sticky shirt clung to my chest. I did not care. I felt powerful. Georgette thought she had shamed me. She was wrong. She had just signed her own sentence. The breakfast was over. The Hunger Games had just begun. The sun had set over Miami, but the lights inside the grand ballroom burned brighter than the day. The charity gala for the Children's Hospital is the most exclusive event of the season on the coast. Tickets cost $1,000 a plate. The room was a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters moved like shadows, carrying trays of champagne and caviar. The air was thick with the sound of string quartets and money-changing hands. I sat at a small table in the very back corner of the room. I was shrouded in the darkness beyond the reach of the crystal chandeliers. I had changed out of my juice-stained shirt. I wore a simple black suit that I keep in my office closet. It was not a designer label. It was off the rack. To the untrained eye, I looked like a retired schoolteacher who had perhaps wandered into the wrong party or a staff member taking a break. I nursed a glass of sparkling water and watched the sharks circle. Blake and his entourage made their entrance 20 minutes late. They wanted to be seen. Blake wore a tuxedo that was clearly rented. The sleeves were a fraction too long. Preston strutted in with a cigar in his breast pocket, violating the non-smoking policy before he even sat down. Georgette had changed into a silver dress that looked like aluminum foil wrapped around a fire hydrant. Nia looked beautiful in blue, but her eyes were darting around the room nervously. She knew they did not belong here. She knew the credit cards were maxed out. She knew they were swimming in waters too deep for them. They sat at a table near the front. Blake immediately began ordering bottles of champagne for the table. He was trying to wash away the humiliation of the morning with alcohol. He laughed too loud. He clapped Preston on the back. He was performing the role of the wealthy benefactor, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He was terrified. The auctioneer took the stage. He was a British man with a voice like melted butter. He sold a trip to Bali for $10,000. He sold a diamond necklace for $15,000. Blake sat on his hands. He wanted to bid. I could see his hand twitching near his paddle. He needed a win. He needed to show his father that the credit card decline at the front desk was just a glitch. He needed to prove he was a big man. Then came the star of the evening. The auctioneer signaled to his assistants. They brought out a velvet pillow. Resting on it was a single bottle of wine. It was a 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild. It was not just wine. It was history. It was one of the most celebrated vintages of the 20th century. The label was designed by Philippe Julien. It was a symbol of victory and endurance. The room went quiet. The auctioneer started the bidding at $5,000. A hand went up near the front. $6,000. $7,000. Blake looked at Preston. Preston nodded encouragement. He whispered something to his son, probably telling him that a man of his stature should have a bottle like that in his cellar. Blake puffed out his chest. He raised his paddle. Number 104, $8,000. The room murmured. Blake looked around, beaming. He had entered the arena. I sat in the shadows. I waited. The bid went to $9,000. Blake raised it to $10,000. He was confident now. He thought he had won. I lifted my finger. I did not have a paddle. I did not need one. The auctioneer knew exactly who I was. He saw my signal in the dark. $11,000 to the gentleman in the back, he announced. Blake whipped his head around. He squinted into the darkness. He could not see me clearly, but he saw the silhouette. He frowned. He raised his paddle again. $12,000. I raised my finger. $13,000. Blake stood up slightly in his chair. He recognized the suit. He recognized the posture. His face flushed red. He realized the old man from the lobby was challenging him. He took it personally. He thought I was spending his inheritance. He thought I was burning his money to spite him. $14,000, he shouted. He did not wait for the auctioneer. 15,000, I said calmly. My voice carried across the room without effort. Blake turned to Nia. I saw him whispering furiously. He was probably telling her that I was senile. He was probably telling her I had stolen a credit card. He looked back at me with hatred. 18,000, Blake screamed. His voice cracked. The room fell silent. $18,000 was a lot of money for a bottle of wine, even for these people. It was certainly a lot of money for a man who could not pay a $5,000 room deposit. I took a sip of my water. I looked at Blake. I saw the sweat on his forehead. I saw the vein throbbing in his neck. He was betting money he did not have to beat a man he did not respect. 20,000, I said. Blake kicked his chair back. He stood up. He lost all composure. He held his paddle up like a weapon. $25,000, he yelled. The crowd gasped. Preston looked at his son with wide eyes. Even he knew this was reckless. Georgette looked thrilled. She thought they had won. She clapped her hands. The auctioneer looked at me. Going once at 25,000. Going twice. I stood up slowly. I buttoned my jacket. I stepped out of the shadows just enough for the light to catch my face. I looked at Blake. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to know that this was not a game. This was an execution. $50,000, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy. It was the sound of oxygen leaving the room. $50,000. It was an absurd amount. It was a statement. Blake turned purple. He looked like he was going to have a stroke. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He shouted at the top of his lungs. This is a joke. That man is a fraud. He is a broke old man who took the bus here. He does not have 50 cents, let alone $50,000. Security turned to look. The guests whispered. Blake felt empowered by his own outburst. He continued to scream. Security, get him out of here. He is ruining the event. He is hallucinating. He is just a janitor my wife feels sorry for. Throw him out before he embarrasses himself further. Blake looked at the security guards stationed by the doors. He gestured for them to grab me. He expected them to drag me away. He expected to be the hero who saved the gala from the crazy intruder. The security guards did not move. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs. They looked at the floor. They knew who signed their checks. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down. It sounded like a gunshot. Sold for $50,000 to Mr. King. Blake froze. He looked at the auctioneer. He looked at me. He laughed a nervous, hysterical laugh. He said, Mr. King. Who is Mr. King? Who is Mr.? His name is Reggie and he lives in a rent-controlled apartment. You people are being scammed. The general manager of the resort walked onto the stage. He picked up the bottle of wine with white-gloved hands. He walked down the stairs. He walked past the table where Blake stood trembling with rage. He walked past Preston, who was staring with his mouth open. He walked all the way to the back of the room. He stopped at my table. He bowed slightly. He placed the bottle gently on the tablecloth in front of me. Current vintage, sir, he said. Shall I have it sent up to the penthouse, or would you like it decanted here? I looked at the bottle. I looked at Blake. He was staring at me. His face was a mask of confusion and horror. He could not process what he was seeing. His brain was trying to reject the reality. He shouted across the room, "He stole it! That old man stole that money. He must have robbed a bank. Call the police. Arrest him." I signaled to the manager. "Send it to the penthouse," I said. "I have some trash to take out before I can enjoy a drink." Blake collapsed into his chair. He looked at Nia. Nia was covering her face with her hands. She knew. Deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. But Blake was too arrogant to see the truth. He genuinely believed I was a criminal. He believed the only way a black man in a cheap suit could have $50,000 was by theft. I sat back down in the shadows. The auction continued. But the party for Blake was over. He just did not know it yet. He sat there seething. He was already planning his revenge. He was going to call the authorities. He was going to expose me. He had no idea he was the one who had been exposed. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Now it was time to snap the jaw shut. The sun beat down on the pool deck of the Royal Palms, turning the white concrete into a blinding mirror. I lay on a plastic lounge chair in the far corner near the towel return bin. I wore a pair of swim trunks I had owned since the 90s. They were a faded navy blue with a drawstring that was fraying at the ends. My chest was bare and my skin looked dry and weathered against the sleek, oiled bodies of the other guests. I had a pair of scratched reading glasses perched on my nose and I held a newspaper in front of my face. To anyone passing by, I was just an old man napping in the heat. But inside the folds of the Miami Herald, I had tucked a confidential due diligence report printed on thick bond paper. I heard the slap of designer sandals on the pavement before I saw them. Blake and Nia were marching toward me. Blake wore swim shorts that were too short and too tight, patterned with little sailboats. He had a gold chain tangled in his chest hair. Nia wore a black swimsuit and a sheer cover-up. She clutched an oversized straw bag to her chest like a shield. They did not look like people on vacation. They looked like people hunting a pest. Blake stopped at the foot of my chair. He cast a long shadow over my newspaper. He did not say, "Excuse me." He kicked the leg of my chair with his foot. It was a sharp, aggressive tap. He said, "Wake up, Reggie. We need to talk." I lowered the paper slowly. I peered over the rim of my glasses. I asked him if he was enjoying the pool. He ignored the question. He crossed his arms. His biceps were soft. He leaned down. His voice was a low hiss. He asked me where I got the money. He asked me about the wine. He said $50,000 does not just fall out of the sky into the lap of a retired janitor. Nia stepped up beside him. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red and puffy. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. She said, "Dad, please be honest with us." She said she was worried sick all night. She said she knows how hard it is to live on a fixed income. She asked if I had done something foolish. She asked if I had gone to a loan shark. Blake let out a cruel laugh. He said, "Loan shark." He said, "Look at him, Nia. No loan shark would give him $5, let alone $50,000. He said he probably stole it. He said he probably dipped into some rainy day fund he had been hiding for his funeral. He said, or maybe he stole a wallet from the locker room." He pointed a finger in my face. He said, "Listen to me, old man." He said, "I do not know what game you are playing, but it ends now." He said, "I am a respected professional." He said, "I am a director of marketing." He said, "I cannot have my father-in-law getting arrested for fraud in the middle of my vacation." He said, "It reflects badly on me." I sat up. I folded the newspaper carefully. I placed it on my lap. I looked at Blake. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead. He was terrified. He was not worried about me. He was worried that my poverty was contagious. He was worried that my presence would reveal his own insecurity. I spoke calmly. I said I did not steal the money, Blake. I said I did not borrow it. I said I simply paid for something I wanted. Blake shook his head. He did not believe me. He could not believe me. His worldview depended on me being beneath him. If I had money, then he was not superior. And if he was not superior, then he was nothing. He leaned closer. He bared his teeth. He said, "You are lying." He said, "You are going to leave this hotel right now." He said, "If you are not gone in 10 minutes, I am going to call the police." He said, "I will tell them you are harassing us." He said, "I will tell them you are senile and dangerous." He said, "I will have you committed to a state facility where they can medicate you until you forget your own name." Nia gasped. She touched his arm. She said, "Blake, that is too far." Blake shook her off. He said, "No, Nia. He needs to learn." He said he is ruining everything. I looked at him. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold satisfaction of a hunter who has the prey in his sights. I tapped the newspaper on my lap. I tapped the hidden report. I asked him how things were at the office. Blake blinked. He straightened up. He looked confused. He asked what the hell I was talking about. He said work was great. He said he was crushing it. He said he was in line for a massive bonus. I nodded slowly. I said, "That is interesting." I said, "Because I read the business section." I said, "I read that Zenith Marketing is in free fall." I said, "I read that they lost the Coca-Cola account last month." I said, "I read that the CEO is looking for a buyer to bail them out before payroll bounces on Friday." Blake went pale. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he was going to faint. He looked at Nia. He saw her looking at him with wide eyes. He realized he had been caught in a lie. He had not told her. He had been pretending everything was fine while the ship sank. He stammered. He said, "That is not true." He said, "You do not know what you are talking about." He said, "That is just industry gossip." He said, "You are reading trash." I continued. I said, "I heard the acquisition is almost done." I said, "I heard the new owners are going to clean house." I said, "I heard they are going to fire the entire marketing department because of gross incompetence and bloated salaries." I said, "It sounds like a bad time to be spending $20,000 on a vacation you cannot afford." Blake stepped back. He looked at me with pure hatred. He could not understand how I knew. He could not fathom that the man in the faded swim trunks had better intel than he did. He laughed. It was a desperate cracking sound. He said, "You are crazy." He said, "You are a senile old man reading tabloids and making up stories to scare me." He said, "My job is secure." He said, I am indispensable. He grabbed Nia's hand. He pulled her away. He said, come on, honey. He said, do not listen to him. He said his mind is gone. He said he is just jealous. He started to walk away. He tried to strut, but his legs were stiff. He was scared. I called out to him. I did not shout. I just raised my voice enough to carry over the sound of the splashing water. I said, we will see, Blake. I said we will see who is indispensable and who is unemployed come Monday morning. Blake froze for a second. He did not turn around. He kept walking. He dragged Nia toward the bar. He needed a drink. He needed to drown the voice in his head that was whispering that I was right. I watched them go. I opened my newspaper again. I looked at the report from my acquisition team. The deal to buy Zenith Marketing was scheduled to close at 9 a.m. on Monday. The restructuring plan was already approved. The first name on the list of redundancies was Blake Anderson. He called me a senile old man. He thought I was reading the funnies. He did not know I was reading his obituary. I adjusted my glasses. I settled back into the chair. The sun felt good. Monday was going to be a very good day. I sat at the antique desk in the penthouse study. The view behind me stretched across the Atlantic Ocean where the moonlight danced on the waves. I held a fountain pen with a gold nib. I wrote on thick cream-colored cardstock embossed with the resort logo. The note was simple. It said, please join me for dinner tonight at the summit to clear the air. I want to make things right. I folded the card and placed it in a matching envelope. I rang the bell on the desk. My personal butler entered the room. He wore a tuxedo that fit better than Blake's wedding suit. I handed him the envelope. I told him to deliver it to the standard rooms on the ground floor near the loading dock. I told him to wait for a response. 20 minutes later, he returned. He kept his face neutral, but I saw the flicker of amusement in his eyes. He said Mr. Anderson accepted the invitation immediately. He said Mr. Anderson told him to tell the old man to bring his checkbook. He said the family seemed very excited. They were already arguing about what to wear. I dressed for dinner with deliberate care. I did not wear a suit this time. I wore the same simple polo shirt and khakis I had worn earlier. I wanted the contrast to be sharp. I wanted them to see the janitor while they played the kings. I took the private elevator up to the summit. The restaurant sits on the 50th floor. It revolves slowly, giving diners a 360-degree view of Miami. The walls are glass. The tables are set with Limoges china and Baccarat crystal. The average bill for 2 people is $1,200 without wine. It is the most expensive table in the city. I arrived early. I sat at the head of the table. I ordered a tap water with no ice. I waited. They arrived 15 minutes late. It was a power move. They wanted me to wait. They wanted to show that my time was less valuable than theirs. Blake walked in first. He had changed into a fresh shirt, but he still looked sweaty. Preston and Georgette followed. They walked with their noses in the air, sniffing the expensive aromas of truffle and searing beef. Nia came last. She looked beautiful in a green silk dress, but her eyes were downcast. She knew this was wrong. She knew they were walking into something heavy. They reached the table. Blake did not say hello. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He looked at me with a smug grin. He said, "Well, Reggie, I am glad you finally came to your senses." He said it takes a big man to admit when he is out of his depth. He said we appreciate the apology dinner. He said he hoped I brought my credit card because they were starving. Preston sat down and immediately picked up the wine list. It was a leather-bound book the size of a Bible. He opened it and whistled. He said, "Look at these prices." He looked at me. He asked if I was sure I could afford this. He said he did not want to be washing dishes in the back. He laughed at his own joke. Georgette laughed with him. It was a cruel sound. I smiled a small, tight smile. I said, "Order whatever you like." I said, "Tonight is about family." I said, "I want you to have the full experience." That was the green light. They did not hold back. They attacked the menu like wolves who had not eaten in weeks. They were not hungry for food. They were hungry for my money. They wanted to punish me for the humiliation at the front desk. They wanted to bleed me dry. The waiter approached. He was a young man I hired from a top hotel in Paris. He knew exactly what was happening. He looked at me for a brief second. I gave him a micro nod. Preston started. He said, "Bring us 2 bottles of the Dom Perignon Rose." He said the vintage one. He pointed to the price. It was $800 a bottle. He looked at me to see if I flinched. I did not blink. Georgette ordered the seafood tower. It is a 3-tiered display of lobster, crab, oysters, and caviar. It costs $400. She said she needed the protein after such a stressful day. She looked at my shirt and wrinkled her nose. She said she hoped the food was better than the company. Blake ordered the A5 Wagyu beef. It is imported from Japan. It costs $30 an ounce. He ordered a 20-ounce steak. He told the waiter to shave fresh truffles on top. He said, "Keep shaving until I say stop." He looked at me and winked. He said, "You only live once, right, Reggie?" He said, "Might as well enjoy the retirement fund while it lasts." Nia ordered a simple salad. She looked uncomfortable. She touched Blake's arm. She whispered that maybe they were ordering too much. Blake brushed her off. He said, "Relax, babe." He said, "Your dad offered." He said he wants to make up for being a jerk. He said, "Let him feel like a provider for once." The food arrived in waves. The table groaned under the weight of silver platters. The champagne flowed. Preston drank, gulping it down like soda. Georgette picked at the lobster with her fingers, grease shining on her chin. Blake cut into his steak with savage delight. He chewed with his mouth open. He talked while he ate. He said, "You know, Reggie, this is almost enough to make me forget about the stunt you pulled at the auction." He said, "Almost." He said, "You really embarrassed yourself there." He said, "I hope you managed to return that wine bottle before they called the cops." He said, "I bet you had to beg for a refund." I sipped my water. I said I kept the bottle. I said it is in a safe place. Blake laughed. He said, "Right." He said, "In your safe place under your mattress." He raised his glass. He proposed a toast. He said to Reggie. He said, "Thanks for the meal, old man." He said, "After this, you should probably head home." He said, "We have the rest of the vacation to enjoy, and we do not want you cramping our style." He said, "Go back to your little apartment and save up for next year." Preston burped loudly. He said, "Hear, hear." He said, "This was a nice gesture, Reggie, but do not think it makes us equals." He said, "You are still just a guest at our table." He said, "Pay the bill and then disappear. That is the best gift you can give us." Georgette licked butter off her thumb. She said, "Honestly, this is the least he could do after ruining my dress this morning." She said, "This dinner barely covers the dry cleaning bill." She ordered another bottle of champagne. She did not ask me. She just told the waiter to keep it coming. I watched them. I watched the greed distort their faces. I watched them gorge themselves on my generosity. They were so confident. They were so sure that they were the predators and I was the prey. They thought I was a desperate old man trying to buy their affection. They did not understand that I was not buying their love. I was buying evidence. I was letting them run up a tab that would become a noose. The meal wound down. The table was a wreckage of empty shells and half-eaten steaks. They ordered dessert. They ordered cognac that cost $100 a glass. They were drunk on alcohol and power. They leaned back in their chairs. They looked satisfied. Blake looked at his watch. He said, "Well, this has been fun, but we have an early tea time tomorrow." He snapped his fingers at the waiter. He shouted, "Check." He pointed at me. He said, "Give it to the gentleman." The waiter placed the leather folder in front of me. I did not open it. I knew the total. It was $18,400 in change. It was the price of a small car. It was an obscenity. I sat there. I did not move to pick it up. I stared at Blake. Nia leaned in close to her husband. Her face was pale. She looked at the folder and then at me. She saw that I was not reaching for my wallet. She saw the calm look in my eyes. The fear that had been simmering in her all night suddenly boiled over. She whispered to Blake. Her voice was trembling, but in the quiet of the VIP section it was audible. She asked him if he was sure about this. She asked him if he was absolutely certain that Dad could pay for this. She said, "Look at the amount, Blake." She said, "What if he cannot cover it?" Blake laughed. It was a loud, wet sound. He patted her hand. He looked at me with a sneer that curled his lip. He spoke loud enough for the next table to hear. He said, "Do not worry, babe." He said, "If he cannot pay it, that is not our problem." He said if his card declines, he can go back to the kitchen. He said he can put on an apron and wash dishes for the next 10 years. He said it would be a fitting end for him. He said, "Frankly, it has nothing to do with us." He stood up. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at me. He said, "Thanks for the grub, Reggie." He said, "Try not to break any plates when you are working off the debt." He turned to leave. He thought he was walking out. He thought the show was over. He had no idea that the curtain had just gone up. The table groaned under the weight of the excess. It was a grotesque display of gluttony. There were 3 tiers of seafood towers dripping with melting ice. There were plates of A5 Wagyu beef seared to perfection and buried under mounds of shaved black truffles. The smell of rich butter and expensive red wine filled the air. It was suffocating. Preston sat to my right. He had tucked a linen napkin into his collar like a bib. He held a lobster tail in one hand and a fork in the other. He tore at the meat with his teeth. Grease shone on his chin. He did not wipe it off. He pointed a greasy finger at me. He said, "Hey, Reggie." He said, "I bet the only lobster you ever saw was on a Red Lobster commercial." He laughed. He choked a little on his wine. He said, "You should try the caviar, old man." He said it costs more per ounce than your entire wardrobe. Georgette was equally repulsive. She was eating foie gras with a spoon. She had ordered the most expensive appetizer on the menu simply because of the price tag. She did not even seem to like it. She swallowed it whole like a pelican. She looked at my empty plate. She looked at my glass of tap water. She rolled her eyes. She said, "Look at him, Preston." She said, "He is trying to save room for the free bread." She said, "Reggie, you are embarrassing us." She said, "Live a little before you keel over." She said, "Try the wine, it tastes like money." I did not touch the food. I did not touch the wine. I sat with my back straight. I kept my hands folded on my lap. I watched them. I watched them devour the food with no appreciation for the craft or the cost. They were not eating to enjoy. They were eating to take. They were eating to punish me. They thought every bite was $1 out of my pocket. They thought every bottle of wine was a dent in my savings. They did not know they were eating their own future. They were gorging themselves on the last supper of their privileged lives. Nia sat across from me. She picked at a salad. She looked pale. She knew this was wrong. She knew the bill would be astronomical. She kept glancing at Blake and then at me. She looked terrified, but she said nothing. She did not tell her father-in-law to use a fork. She did not tell her husband to stop ordering. She was complicit in her silence. That hurt more than the insults. Blake was the conductor of this orchestra of greed. He waved the waiter over every 5 minutes. He ordered another bottle of the Chateau Margaux. It was $5,000 a bottle. He did not even look at the label. He just wanted the most expensive liquid in the room. He poured it for everyone except me. He filled his glass to the brim. He spilled a little on the tablecloth. He did not care. He looked at me with a smirk that was pure malice. He stood up. He was flushed with alcohol and arrogance. He tapped his knife against his crystal goblet. The sharp ring cut through the conversation. He cleared his throat. He wanted an audience. He looked around the dining room, ensuring the other diners saw him. He raised his glass high. He said, "I want to propose a toast." He looked down at me. His eyes were glazed but hard. He said to my father-in-law, "Reggie," he said, "thank you for finally realizing your role." He said, "This dinner is a nice gesture." He said, "It almost makes up for your cheap behavior earlier. But let us be real, Reggie." He said, "You do not belong at this table. You do not belong in this resort. You are a fish out of water, and you are suffocating us." He leaned in closer. His voice dropped to a cruel sneer. He said, "Enjoy the view tonight, Reggie, because this is it." He said, "After this meal, you need to pack your bags." He said, "You need to know your place, and your place is not here with us." He said, "Do yourself a favor and disappear before you embarrass yourself any further." He said, "Leave the high life to the people who were born for it." Preston cheered. He raised a lobster claw in the air. He said, "Hear, hear." He said, "Well said, son." Georgette clapped her hands. She said, "Bye-bye, Reggie." The table fell silent, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg. They expected me to explode in anger. I picked up my water glass. The condensation was cool against my fingertips. I took a slow sip. I set it down gently on the white tablecloth. I looked up at Blake. I looked at his sweating face. I looked at his cheap suit. I looked at the fear hiding behind his arrogance. I nodded slowly. I spoke in a voice that was calm and steady. I said, "You are right, Blake. I said, you are absolutely right. I said, after this meal, everything is going to go exactly where it belongs. Everyone is going to be in their rightful place." Blake laughed. He thought I was agreeing to leave. He thought he had won. He drained his glass. He sat back down with a satisfied sigh. He signaled for the check. He had no idea that when I said everyone would be in their rightful place, I meant he would be in the street and I would be on the throne. The feast was over. The bill was due. The waiter approached our table with the leather folio held firmly in both hands. He placed it on the white tablecloth directly in front of me. It sat there like a verdict. The black leather was smooth and cold. Blake leaned back in his chair, picking his teeth with a silver toothpick. He smirked. He gestured with his head toward the bill. He said, "Go ahead, Reggie." He said, "Do the honors." He said, "Try not to have a heart attack when you see the total." Preston laughed. He patted his stomach. He said that was a meal fit for a king. He said, "Thanks for the treat, old-timer." He reached for his water glass, expecting the show to end with me pulling out a worn wallet and emptying my savings. I did not touch the folio. I did not even look at it. I picked up my napkin from my lap. I folded it neatly into a square. I placed it next to my plate. I looked at Blake. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has just closed the trap door. I reached out with one finger. I pushed the leather folio across the table. It slid smoothly over the linen. It stopped right in front of Blake. I said, "This is for you." Blake frowned. He looked at the folio. He looked at me. He laughed nervously. He said, "Very funny, Reggie." He said, "Stop playing games." He said, "Pay the man so we can leave." I shook my head. I said, "I am not playing games, Blake." I said, "I invited you to dinner." I said, "I wanted you to have the experience." I said, "But I never said I would pay for your gluttony." I said, "My rule has always been simple." I said, "He who orders pays." I said, "You ordered the wine. You ordered the beef. You ordered the truffles." I said, "I had a glass of tap water." I said, "That is free." The silence at the table was absolute. Naya dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her plate. Her face went white. She whispered, "Dad, what are you doing?" She said, "You cannot be serious." Preston slammed his hand on the table. He shouted, "What is the meaning of this?" He said, "You invited us." He said, "This is entrapment." He said, "You are trying to embarrass us." I looked at him. I said, "Embarrassment is a choice, Preston." I said, "Just like ordering a $5,000 bottle of wine is a choice." I said, "You made your choices. Now you pay the bill." Blake opened the folio. His hands were shaking. He looked at the total. His eyes bulged. He gasped. He said, $18,400. He looked up at me. He screamed, "Are you insane?" He said, "I do not have $18,000 on me." He said, "You know that." He said, "You set us up." I leaned forward. I said, "Set you up." I said, "Did I force you to order the Wagyu? Did I force you to order the vintage champagne? Did I force you to treat the waiter like a servant?" I said, "No, Blake." I said, "You did all that on your own." I said, "You wanted to live like a king." I said, "Now you have to pay the king ransom." Georgette started to hyperventilate. She fanned herself with her napkin. She said, "I am going to faint." She said, "This cannot be happening." She said, "Someone do something." Blake looked around the room. People were staring. He was trapped. He looked at me with hatred. He realized I was not going to budge. He realized he had no choice. He had to pay or he had to face the consequences. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek black card. It was his corporate credit card, the one issued by Zenith Marketing for business expenses only. Using it for a personal dinner was grounds for immediate termination. It was embezzlement. But he was desperate. He thought he could cover it up later. He thought he could claim it was a client dinner. He threw the card at the waiter. He said, "Just run it." He said, "I will deal with you later, Reggie." He said, "You are going to regret this." The waiter took the card. He walked to the terminal station near our table. He inserted the card. We all watched. The machine beeped. It was a loud, harsh sound. The waiter looked at the screen. He removed the card. He walked back to the table. He placed the card in front of Blake. He said, "I am sorry, sir." He said, "The card has been declined." He said, "The message says card reported lost or stolen. Please confiscate." Blake stood up. He shouted, "That is a lie." He shouted, "Call the bank." He shouted, "Run it again." Preston stood up too. He said, "Here, use mine." He threw his card on the table. The waiter took it. He ran it. Beep. Declined. Insufficient funds. The flight tickets and the room upgrade attempt had maxed it out. Panic set in. Real, primal panic. Blake looked at Nia. Nia shook her head. She was crying. She said, "I do not have any money, Blake." She said, "You know I do not." Blake looked at me. He begged. He said, "Reggie, please." He said, "Stop this." He said, "Help us." He said, "We will pay you back." He said, "Do not let them arrest us." I sat still. I took a sip of water. I said, "I cannot help you, Blake." I said, "I am just a retired janitor, remember?" I said, "I do not have that kind of money." The general manager appeared at the table. He was flanked by 2 large security guards. He looked grave. He looked at Blake. He spoke clearly. He said, "Excuse me, sir." He said, "We have a problem." He said, "The bill must be settled immediately." He said, "If you cannot pay, we will be forced to involve the authorities." He said, "Theft of services is a felony in this state." He said, "Especially for this amount." Blake started to sweat. He loosened his tie. He said, "Wait." He said, "Give me a minute." He said, "I can call my boss." He said, "I can fix this." The manager shook his head. He said, "I'm afraid we do not have a minute, sir." He said the police are already on their way for an unrelated matter, but I can easily redirect them here. He said you have 30 seconds to produce a valid form of payment or you will be escorted to the holding room. Blake looked at me one last time. He saw no mercy in my eyes. He saw only the reflection of his own greed. He realized the game was over. He realized the old man in the polo shirt had just checkmated him in front of the entire world, and the police sirens were getting closer. The blue and red lights flashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the summit. They cut through the ambient lighting of the dining room like a strobe light in a nightmare. 2 uniformed police officers walked into the restaurant. They walked with the heavy, purposeful stride of men who are used to cleaning up messes. They were led by a sergeant. He was a thick man with a mustache that twitched when he frowned. He looked at the scene. He saw a table covered in expensive leftovers. He saw a crying woman. He saw 2 older people looking indignant. He saw a young man sweating through his suit, and he saw me sitting calmly with a glass of water. Blake jumped up as soon as he saw them. He did not wait for them to approach. He ran to meet them. He pointed a shaking finger back at me. He shouted, "Officer over here." He said, "Thank God you are here." He said, "You need to arrest that man immediately." He said he is a con artist. He said he lured us here under false pretenses. He said he committed fraud. The sergeant looked at Blake. He looked at his disheveled tie. He looked at the desperation in his eyes. He did not look impressed. He asked Blake to calm down. He asked what the problem was. Blake took a deep breath. He tried to sound like an executive. He tried to sound like a victim. He said that man invited us to dinner. He said he promised to pay. He said he ordered all this food and wine. He said now the bill is here and he is refusing to pay. He said he is trying to stick us with the check. He said it is entrapment. Preston chimed in from the table. He shouted, "That is right, officer." He said we are respectable tourists. He said we were just trying to be nice to a lonely old man. He said he tricked us. He said he probably does this all the time. He said look at him. He does not have 2 nickels to rub together. Nia was sobbing now. Real ugly tears. She grabbed the arm of the second officer. She begged him. She said, "Please do not arrest my husband." She said he has a reputation. She said he is a director of marketing. She said this is all a misunderstanding. She said my father is just confused. She said he is senile. She said he forgot his wallet. I sat still. I did not speak. I let them dig. I let them pour all their lies onto the floor. I watched the sergeant's face. He was listening, but he was also observing. He looked at the magnum of champagne. He looked at the truffles. He looked at the bill that the manager handed him. He whistled low. He said $18,000. He looked at Blake. He said that is a lot of food for a victim to eat, son. Blake stammered. He said we were just being polite. He said we did not want to be rude. The sergeant walked over to me. He stood in front of my chair. He looked down at me. He asked for my identification. I reached into my pocket. I moved slowly so as not to alarm him. I pulled out my old leather wallet. I took out my state ID card. It was simple. It had my photo and my name, Reginald King. I handed it to him. The sergeant took the card. He shined his flashlight on it even though the room was well lit. He looked at the name. He looked at the address. He froze. His eyes widened just a fraction. He looked at me again. He looked closer. He recognized the name. Everyone in Miami law enforcement knows the name King. We donate heavily to the Police Benevolent Fund. We host their annual gala for free. The sergeant lowered the flashlight. His posture changed. The aggression vanished. He handed me back my ID with 2 hands. He nodded respectfully. He turned slowly to face Blake. He asked Blake a simple question. He asked if he had a written contract stating that Mr. King would pay for the dinner. Blake blinked. He said, "What?" He said, "No, of course not." He said it was a verbal invitation. He said he sent a note. The sergeant asked if he had the note. Blake patted his pockets frantically. He checked his jacket. He checked his pants. He realized he had left it in the room. Or maybe he threw it away. He said, "I do not have it on me." He said, "But," he said it. He said, "Ask anyone." The sergeant shook his head. He said, "So let me get this straight. You ordered $18,000 worth of food and alcohol. You consumed it. You enjoyed it. And now you cannot pay for it. And your defense is that this gentleman told you he would treat you." Blake said yes. He said exactly. The sergeant laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. He said, "Sir, that is not fraud. That is a dining dispute. And in this state, if you eat the food, you own the debt." He said, "Unless you have proof he forced you to eat that lobster, you are liable for the bill." Blake's face crumbled. He said, "But I cannot pay." He said, "My cards are not working." The sergeant sighed. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt. He said, "Then this is theft of services." He said, "It is a felony." He said, "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Nia screamed. She screamed no. She tried to pull Blake away. Preston stood up and shouted, "Do not touch my son." Georgette fainted or pretended to faint in her chair. It was chaos. The officer grabbed Blake's wrist. He spun him around. He clicked the metal cuff onto one wrist. Blake was crying now. He was begging. He said, "Reggie, please." He said, "Tell them." He said, "Help me." I watched. I felt nothing. It was the consequence of his actions finally catching up to him. It was physics. Suddenly the double doors of the restaurant burst open. A group of men in suits walked in. They walked with urgency. In the center was Javier, the general manager. He looked impeccable even at this late hour. He saw the police. He saw the handcuffs. He saw me sitting at the table. He did not look at Blake. He did not look at the police. He looked directly at me. He walked straight through the scene. He raised a hand to the sergeant. He spoke with absolute authority. He said, "Stop." He said, "Officer, please release that man immediately." He said, "Do not disturb our VIP guest." He said, "We will handle this internally." The sergeant looked confused. He looked at me. He looked at Javier. He unlocked the cuff. Blake rubbed his wrist. He looked at Javier with hope. He thought he was saved. He thought the manager had come to rescue him because he was a Diamond member. He thought his status had finally been recognized. He pointed at me. He shouted to Javier. He said, "Thank you." He said, "Throw this old bum out." He said he caused all this trouble. Javier ignored him. He stood next to my chair. He stood at attention. He waited. The room was silent again. Everyone was watching. The police stepped back. Blake smiled a wobbly smile. He thought he had won. He had no idea that the man who just saved him from jail was about to send him to hell. Javier ignored Blake completely. He walked past the police officers who stepped aside instinctively. He walked past the table covered in the debris of their gluttony. He stopped directly in front of me. He did not look at my worn sneakers. He did not look at the orange juice stain on my polo shirt. He looked me in the eyes with the absolute reverence of a soldier facing his commander. He clasped his hands behind his back. He bowed. It was not a casual nod. It was a formal deep bow of 90 degrees. It was a gesture of total submission. The restaurant went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped at the other tables. The waiters froze in place. The air conditioning hummed loudly in the void of sound. Javier straightened up. He spoke in a clear professional voice that carried to every corner of the room. He said, "Good evening, Mr. Chairman." He said, "I apologize for the disturbance." He said, "We were not aware you were conducting a site inspection this evening." He asked if everything was to my satisfaction. He asked if I had any instructions regarding these individuals. The words hung in the air like smoke. "Mr. Chairman." Blake stood there with one wrist still in the metal handcuff. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain was trying to process the input and failing. He looked at Javier. He looked at me. He blinked rapidly. He stammered. He said, "Wait." He said, "What did you call him?" He said, "This is Reggie." He said, "He is a janitor." He said, "He is my father-in-law." He said, "You have them mixed up." He said, "This is a mistake." Preston was holding a glass of the expensive cognac he had ordered. His hand began to shake. It shook so violently that the amber liquid sloshed over the rim and onto his hand. His fingers went numb. The crystal snifter slipped from his grip. It hit the marble floor. It shattered with a sound like a gunshot. The noise made everyone jump except me. Preston did not look down at the broken glass. He stared at me with eyes wide with terror. He realized in that second that he had just insulted a man who could buy and sell him 10 times over. Georgette stopped fanning herself. She looked at my shirt, the shirt she had stained on purpose. She looked at my face. She saw the resemblance to the portrait hanging in the main lobby, the portrait she had walked past 10 times without looking. She turned a sickly shade of green. She realized the man she called a vagrant owned the building she was sitting in. She realized she had assaulted the owner of the hotel. Nia was the worst. She did not look scared. She looked confused. She looked at me as if I had grown a second head. She whispered, "Dad." She asked what is happening. She asked why he is calling you chairman. She looked at my calm face. She looked at the way the staff was looking at me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She realized she did not know her own father. She realized she had underestimated me for her entire life. She realized the man she treated like a burden was actually the titan holding up the sky. The police sergeant looked at Javier. He looked at me. He looked at the ID card in my hand that said Reginald King. He put the pieces together. He holstered his baton. He stepped back from Blake as if Blake were radioactive. He took off his cap. He looked at me and said, "Mr. King, I had no idea." He said, "I apologize, sir." He said, "We were told there was a theft in progress." I stood up slowly. I did not use the table for support. I stood up straight. The posture of the tired old man vanished. I stood with the bearing of a man who has built an empire from nothing. I looked at Blake. I looked at him with cold indifference. I spoke. My voice was steady and deep. I said, "You wanted to know who I am, Blake. I said you wanted to know where I got the money. I said you called me a fraud. I said you were right about one thing. I said I am a fraud. I said I pretended to be poor to see if you were decent. I said I pretended to be weak to see if you were cruel. I said I pretended to be helpless to see if you would help me. I said you failed every single test." Blake shook his head. He said no. He said this is a prank. He said you are lying. He said tell them Javier. He said tell them he is nobody. Javier looked at Blake with ice in his eyes. He said, "Sir, you are speaking to Reginald King." He said he is the founder and chairman of King Hospitality Group. He said he owns this resort. He said he owns this island. He said he owns the mortgage on the building where your office is located. He said, "Show some respect." Blake collapsed into his chair. The handcuff clattered against the wood. He looked at the bill on the table. $18,000. He looked at me. He realized that $18,000 was nothing to me. He realized that for me this was not about money. It was about the lesson. I looked at Nia. She was crying silently. She reached out a hand toward me. She said, "Dad, why?" She said, "Why did you not tell us?" She said we would have treated you differently. I looked at her. I said, "That is exactly why I did not tell you, Nia." I said I did not want to be treated differently because of my money. I said I wanted to be treated with respect because I am your father. I said I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for what I can buy. I said you showed me that without the money I am nothing to you. The room was still silent. The guests at the other tables were watching with fascination. They knew they were witnessing a massacre. Javier waited. He stood at attention. He asked again. He said, "Mr. Chairman, do you have any instructions?" I looked at the table. I looked at the half-eaten lobster. I looked at the spilled cognac. I looked at the people who had feasted on my generosity and spat in my face. I felt no pity. I felt no hesitation. I looked at the police sergeant. I said, "Officer, you can remove the handcuffs." I said I do not want this man arrested for theft of services. Blake looked up with hope. He thought I was saving him. He thought I was going to pay the bill and let him go. He thought he had survived. I continued. I said, "I do not want him arrested because that would be too easy. I said I want him to experience the consequences of his actions as a free man. I said I want him to walk out of here and face the world he created." I turned to Javier. I spoke with the authority that comes from 40 years of hard work. I said the food was excellent, Javier. I said the service was impeccable. I said, but the atmosphere is polluted. I said I cannot enjoy my resort while it is infested with parasites. I pointed at Blake. I pointed at Preston and Georgette. I pointed at Nia. I said my instruction is simple. I said clean this trash out of my restaurant. I said remove them from my property immediately. I said revoke their access. I said put them on the street. Javier nodded. He signaled to his security team. 4 large men in black suits stepped forward. They did not smile. They moved toward the table. Blake stood up. He shouted no. He shouted, "You cannot do this." He shouted, "I am family." I turned my back on him. I sat down. I picked up my glass of water. I took a sip. I said I have no family here. I said I only see guests who have overstayed their welcome. The security guards grabbed them. They did not be gentle. They pulled Preston out of his chair. They took Georgette by the arm. They guided Blake and Nia toward the exit. The guests watched them go. They watched the arrogant people who had marched in like kings being dragged out like criminals. I watched the elevator doors close on their screaming faces. The silence returned to the room. The air felt cleaner. I looked at Javier. I said, "Thank you, Javier." I said, "Now bring me the wine list." I said, "I have something to celebrate." The security guards held them near the elevators. Blake was limp in their grip. Nia was sobbing into her hands. Preston and Georgette looked like statues of misery. I could have let them go then. I could have let them disappear into the night with their shame. But I am a man who believes in being thorough. When you clean a house, you do not leave dust in the corners. You sweep until the floor shines, and there was still a lot of dust left to clear. I signaled to the head of security. I raised one finger. He understood. He stopped his men. He turned Blake and Nia around to face me one last time. They looked broken. They looked defeated. But they still did not understand the full scope of their reality. They thought this was just about a dinner bill. They thought this was just about a secret fortune. They did not know that their entire existence was a house of cards that I had built and that I was about to blow down. I walked over to Nia. I stood close enough to smell the expensive perfume she bought with my money. I looked at her tear-stained face. I saw the confusion in her eyes. She still believed in the myth of her husband. She still believed that despite his card being declined, he was a successful man who had just hit a rough patch. She needed to see the rot. I spoke softly. I said, Nia, look at me. I said, stop crying and listen, because this is the last time I will explain the math of your life. I said, you look at your husband and you see a provider. You see the man who bought you the house in the gated community. You see the man who leases the Mercedes in the driveway. You see the man who takes you to 5-star dinners. I said, you are blind, Nia. She shook her head. She whispered that Blake works hard. She said he has a high salary. She said they have savings. I laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of a judge reading a sentence. I said Blake has not paid for a significant expense in 10 years. I said his salary barely covers the interest on his gambling debts. I said the house, the cars, the clothes, and the vacations were all paid for by a silent partner. Nia frowned. She asked what I meant. She asked who. I pointed to my chest. I said me. I said 10 years ago when you finished your residency, I set up a blind trust. I wanted you to have security. I wanted you to have a safety net so you could practice medicine without fear. I deposited $12,000 into that account every single month for a decade. I channeled it through a shell company so you would think it was a residual return on an investment or a tax rebate. I gave you $1.5 million, Nia. Her eyes went wide. She stopped breathing for a second. She looked at Blake. Blake looked at the floor. He knew. He had suspected for years that the money came from somewhere, but he never asked questions because he liked spending it too much. I continued. I said I watched you spend it. I watched you buy designer bags while I took the bus. I watched you redecorate your living room 3 times while I sat on a sofa from the thrift store. I did not say a word because I wanted you to be happy. But you were not happy, Nia. You became arrogant. You became cruel. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I showed her a photo of the metal credit card Blake had tried to use at the front desk, the one Sarah had cut up. I said, do you recognize this card? I said you gave it to Blake to pay for this trip. You told him to put the deposit on it. I said, that is not a bank card, Nia. That is a supplementary card on my personal American Express Centurion account. I gave it to you 5 years ago for medical emergencies. I told you to keep it safe. I told you it was for life or death. I stepped closer. I said you gave it to this man to book a suite I own to exclude me from a vacation I paid for. I said that is why it was declined. I said it was not a system error. I said I called American Express this morning. I said I canceled the card. I said I closed the blind trust. I said I cut the wire. Nia looked as if she had been slapped. The reality crashed down on her. The lifestyle she loved, the security she felt, the arrogance she wore like a coat, it was all borrowed. It was all mine. She realized she was not a rich doctor's wife. She was a spoiled daughter living on an allowance she had just lost. I turned my attention to Blake. He was trembling. He was not trembling from anger anymore. He was trembling from fear. He knew what was coming next. He remembered our conversation by the pool. He remembered my warning about Monday morning. I looked him up and down. I looked at his rented tuxedo. I looked at his fake watch. I said, and you, Blake, I said the big director of marketing. I said the man who is indispensable. He tried to speak. He tried to say something defiant. He squeaked. He said, leave me alone. I shook my head. I said, I cannot do that, Blake. I said, because we are colleagues now. Or rather, we were colleagues for about 8 hours. He looked confused. He asked what I was talking about. I said, remember the acquisition rumors. I said, remember the due diligence report I was reading by the pool. I said, you told me I was reading tabloids. I said I was reading the purchase agreement. I stepped into his personal space. I said, at 8 o'clock this morning, King Hospitality Group formally acquired Zenith Marketing. I said I bought your company, Blake. I said I own the desk you sit at. I own the computer you use to browse betting sites. I own the coffee machine you stand around while you brag about deals you never closed. Blake went pale. He looked like a man who was watching an oncoming train. I said I spent the afternoon reviewing the personnel files. I said I looked at the expense accounts. I said I saw the client dinners that never happened. I said I saw the flights to Las Vegas booked as business development. I said I saw the invoices for consulting fees paid to companies that do not exist. I lowered my voice. I wanted him to hear the steel in my tone. I said that is embezzlement, Blake. I said that is grand larceny. I said corporate theft is a serious crime. He started to cry. He did not sob like Nia. He wept like a coward. He said no. He said it was just a few times. He said he was going to pay it back. I said it is too late for that. I said, as the new owner of Zenith Marketing, my first official act was to terminate your employment for cause. I said, you are fired, Blake. I said, you lost your job this morning while you were sleeping in the bed I paid for. I said, but that is not the worst part. I said, I have already forwarded the audit results to the district attorney. I said, my lawyers are filing a civil suit to recover the stolen funds. I said, the police waiting outside are not just there for a dining dispute. I said, they have a warrant for your arrest regarding the company funds. Blake's knees gave out. He collapsed. The security guards had to hold him up by his armpits. He hung there like a wet rag. He had lost everything. He had lost his job. He had lost his money. He had lost his reputation. And he was about to lose his freedom. Preston and Georgette watched in horror. They realized their son was not the golden boy. He was a criminal. They realized the gravy train had not just stopped, it had derailed and exploded. I looked at them all. The broken family, the liars, the thieves. I felt a great weight lift off my shoulders. I had carried their secrets for too long. I had enabled their behavior with my silence. Now the truth was out and it was blinding. I said, take them away. The guards dragged Blake toward the door. He was wailing now. He was screaming that he was sorry. He was screaming that he did not mean it. Nia ran after him. She was screaming his name. She did not look at me. She followed the disaster she had married. I watched them go. I straightened my shirt. I picked up the bottle of wine, the 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild. I held it up to the light. It was dark and complex and priceless, just like the truth. I turned to the waiter. I said, open this. I said, I think I finally have my appetite back. Blake was gone. The double doors swung shut behind his wailing figure and the silence rushed back into the room like water filling a void. Preston and Georgette were left standing at the table. They looked like two actors who had forgotten their lines in the middle of a play. The arrogance that had defined them for the last 3 hours had evaporated. The superiority was gone. All that remained was the naked, shivering fear of people who suddenly realize they have no safety net. Preston cleared his throat. It was a wet, desperate sound. He tried to smile. It was a ghastly expression that showed too many teeth. He reached for his wine glass out of habit, then remembered he could not afford the liquid inside it. He pulled his hand back as if the crystal were hot. He looked at me. He tried to summon the camaraderie of a peer. He said, Reggie, old pal. He said, let us not be hasty. He said, we were just having a bit of fun. He said, you know how it is. He said, boys will be boys. He said, surely we can work something out between gentlemen. Georgette tried to smooth the front of her silk caftan. She tried to summon the haughty woman who had spilled juice on me that morning. She failed. She looked small and withered under the bright lights of the chandelier. She looked at me with pleading eyes that were rimmed with smudged mascara. She said, we are family, Reggie. She said, think of the grandchildren you might have one day. She said, don't be harsh. She said, we made a mistake, but we are all adults here. She said, surely you don't mean to kick us out. I looked at them. I felt a cold disgust that settled in my stomach like lead. These were the people who mocked my clothes. These were the people who treated the staff like dirt. These were the people who raised a son to be a thief and then cheered him on as he spent stolen money. I signaled to Javier. I told him to bring me the tablet. He handed it to me with a sharp nod. I tapped the screen a few times to bring up the file I needed. I turned the tablet around and placed it on the table amidst the ruin of their feast. I said, Preston, I want you to look at this. I said, do you recognize this document? Preston squinted. He leaned in over the lobster shells. He gasped. His face turned the color of ash. He said, that is my mortgage. I said, correct. I said, it is the mortgage on your 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. I said, the house you have refinanced 3 times to pay for your leased cars and your country club fees. I said, the house that is currently 90 days past due because you spent your mortgage payments on first-class tickets to Miami. I said, this morning while you were eating breakfast and laughing at my expense, I made a call to my acquisitions department. I said I instructed them to purchase a bundle of distressed assets from your bank. I said your mortgage was in that bundle, Preston. I said I own your note. I said I own your house. Georgette screamed. It was a short, sharp sound. She grabbed Preston's arm and dug her nails into his sleeve. She asked if it was true. She asked if they were going to lose the house. I said it is very true. I said as the new note holder I have reviewed your payment history. I said, it is abysmal. I said, usually I would offer a restructuring plan to a struggling family. I said I would offer a grace period. I stood up. I walked around the table. I stood right in front of them. I loomed over them. I said, but I only offer grace to people who deserve it. I said, you do not deserve grace. I said, you deserve reality. I said, here is the deal. I said, the bill for this dinner is $18,400. I said, I am adding that to your outstanding principal effective immediately. I said, I am calling the loan due. I said, you have 30 days to pay the full balance of $460,000 plus the dinner bill plus the legal fees. I said, if the money is not in my account by the first of the month, I will initiate foreclosure proceedings. I said, I will evict you. I said, I will put your furniture on the curb. I said, I will sell the house to recover my losses, and I will sue you for the deficiency. I said, you will spend your retirement in a rental trailer if you are lucky. Preston fell to his knees. He literally dropped to the floor of the 3-star Michelin restaurant. He grabbed my hand. His palms were sweaty. He begged. He said, Reggie, please. He said, we have nowhere to go. He said, we are retired. He said, we are old. I pulled my hand away. I wiped it on my napkin. I said, I am old too, Preston. I said, you called me a senile old man. I said, you told me to go back to the kitchen. I said, you told me to know my place. I said, well, I know my place. My place is the creditor, your place is the debtor, and the debt is due. I looked at Javier. I said, remove them. I said, I want my restaurant clean. The security guards stepped forward. They did not ask nicely this time. They grabbed Preston by the arms and hauled him up from the floor. They took Georgette by the elbows. She was crying hysterically now. She was shouting that she was a VIP. She was shouting that this was illegal. Javier spoke over her screams. He said, you are not a VIP, madam. He said, you are a trespasser. They dragged them through the dining room. The other guests watched in silence. They saw the tacky clothes. They saw the fear. They saw the end of the charade. It was a public execution of their social status. They were humiliated in front of the very people they had tried so hard to impress. I followed them to the door. I wanted to see them leave. I wanted to make sure the cancer was fully excised from my property. We took the elevator down to the lobby. The doors opened. The guards threw them out onto the marble floor near the main entrance. Blake was already there. The police had released him with a citation, but he was waiting for his parents because he had no money for a cab. He was sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. Naya was standing next to him. She looked lost. She saw her in-laws being thrown out like garbage. She saw me standing in the elevator with the general manager. The guards pushed Preston and Georgette toward the glass doors. They stumbled. They ran toward the exit. They wanted to escape the eyes of the staff. They wanted to escape the shame. Blake stood up. He looked at his parents running away. He looked at the security guards blocking his path back in. He looked at Nia, and then he looked at me. His face twisted with rage. It was ugly. He needed someone to blame. He could not blame himself. That would require a spine. He needed a scapegoat for his destruction. Naya reached out to him. She was crying. She said, Blake, honey. She said, we will figure this out. She said, I am sorry. She tried to touch his shoulder. Blake slapped her hand away. He did not just push it. He struck her. He shoved her hard in the chest. Nia stumbled back in her high heels. She fell onto the hard floor of the lobby. She looked up at him in shock. She had never seen him violent. She had only seen him weak. Blake screamed at her. His voice echoed off the high ceilings. He screamed, "It is your fault." He pointed a shaking finger at me standing in the elevator. He screamed, "It is your crazy father's fault." He screamed, "You ruined my life." He said, "I married you for the lifestyle." He said, "I married you because you were supposed to be my ticket." He said, "You are worthless without his money." He said, "You are nothing but an anchor around my neck." He spat on the floor near her. He said, "I am done." He turned and ran out the automatic doors. He ran into the humid Miami night to face a future that included prison bars and poverty. He left his wife on the floor. Nia sat there. She watched him go. She did not chase him this time. She looked at the empty space where her husband used to be. Then she looked at me. She saw the man she had betrayed standing tall and untouched. She saw the father she had rejected. I did not step out of the elevator. I did not go to help her up. She needed to feel the cold marble. She needed to feel the rock bottom. She needed to understand that she had chosen a monster over her own blood. I pressed the button for the penthouse. The gold doors began to slide shut. I watched her sitting there alone in the middle of my lobby. The lesson was complete. Now the rebuilding could begin. But first she had to learn how to stand up on her own. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, but it did not warm the room. I stood by the glass looking out at the endless expanse of the Atlantic. My coffee was black and bitter, just the way I like it. The silence in the suite was heavy, but it was clean. It was the silence that comes after a storm has washed away the debris. There was a knock at the door. It was not the confident rap of a guest who belongs. It was a soft, hesitant sound. It was the sound of someone who knows they have lost the right to enter. I walked to the door. I opened it slowly. Nia stood there. She looked like a shadow of the woman who had strutted through the lobby yesterday. Her designer dress was rumpled and stained. Her hair was a tangled mess. Her face was swollen and blotchy from hours of crying. She was not wearing her shoes. She held her expensive sandals in one hand like a beggar holding out a cup. She was barefoot on the plush carpet of the hallway. She looked up at me. Her lip quivered. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She dropped her shoes. She fell to her knees. She did not care about her dignity anymore. She did not care about appearances. She cared about survival. She sobbed. She said, "Dad." She said, "Please." She said, "I have nowhere to go." She said, "Blake left me." She said, "He took the cash from my purse and ran." She said, "I am alone in this city." She said, "I am so sorry." I looked down at her. I felt a flicker of the old instinct, the urge to pick her up and tell her everything would be all right. But I crushed it. That instinct was what had created this monster. That instinct was the enabler. I stepped back. I said, "Get up, Nia." I said, "Stand on your feet." I said, "You are a king. We do not kneel." She struggled to stand. She leaned against the doorframe for support. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She looked pathetic. She said, "Dad, I didn't mean to hurt you." She said, "Blake made me do it." She said, "He is controlling." She said, "He told me we had to impress his parents." She said, "I was scared of him." She said, "I just wanted to keep the peace." I shook my head. I walked back into the living room. I sat on the white leather sofa. I gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite me. She sat on the edge as if she expected the chair to eject her. I spoke calmly. I said, "Stop lying, Nia." I said, "Stop blaming Blake for your character flaws." I said, "Blake is a thief and a fool, but he did not force you to be ashamed of your father." I said, "I remember the dinner at your house." I said, "I remember you telling me I would not fit in." I said, "I remember you looking at my clothes with disgust." I said, "I remember you choosing his parents over me." I said, "That was not Blake. That was you." She started to cry harder. She said, "I know." She said I was stupid. She said I was trying to fit into his world. She said I thought that if I looked perfect and acted rich, they would accept me. She said I lost myself. I said, "And what did that cost you?" I said, "You sold your father for a seat at a table where you were the main course." I said, "You let them mock me. You let them throw money at me. You let them treat me like a dog. And you said nothing. You watched. You agreed." I leaned forward. I wanted her to see my eyes. I wanted her to see the resolve. I said, "I do not blame you for being poor, Nia." I said, "There is no shame in poverty. I came from poverty. I built this empire from poverty." I said, "I do not blame you for marrying a loser. Love makes us blind." I said, "I blame you for being a coward." I said, "That is the sin I cannot forgive." I said, "You saw injustice and you stayed silent because it was comfortable. You saw cruelty and you looked away because it was convenient. You sold your self-respect for a vacation. You sold your soul for a hotel room." Nia looked down at her hands. She knew I was right. She could not argue with the truth. The shame radiated off her in waves. She whispered, "What do I do now?" She said, "I have no money." She said, "The cards are canceled." She said, "The house is in foreclosure." She said, "I cannot go back there." She said, "I have lost everything." I looked at her. I saw the potential she once had. I saw the medical degree she barely used. I saw the intelligent woman buried under layers of vanity and fear. I decided to give her one last gift. It was not money. It was opportunity. I stood up. I walked to the desk. I picked up a bundle of fabric that I had requested from housekeeping earlier that morning. It was folded neatly. It was gray polyester. It was stiff. It was a uniform. I walked back to her. I held it out. I said, I am not going to give you money, Nia. I said, the bank is closed forever. I said, I am not going to pay your rent. I am not going to buy your clothes. I am not going to bail you out of the mess you made. She looked at the bundle. She asked what it was. I said, it is a uniform. I said, I spoke to the head of human resources this morning. I said, we have an opening. I said, it is a position at the front desk. I said, it is the night shift receptionist. I said, it pays minimum wage plus tips if you are polite. Nia stared at the gray fabric. She looked at me. She said, you want me to work here, she said, as a receptionist. She said, Dad, I am a doctor. I said, you were a doctor. I said, now you are a destitute woman with no home and no income. I said, a doctor would have known better than to marry a con man. I said, a doctor would have had enough spine to defend her father. I said, this is the offer, Nia. I said, you can take this job. You can live in the staff dormitories in the basement. You can eat in the employee cafeteria. You can work your way up. You can learn what it means to earn $1 instead of stealing it. I said, or you can leave. And I said, you can walk out that door and find your own way in Miami. I said, maybe you can find Blake. I said, maybe he has a plan. The room was silent. The air conditioner hummed. Nia looked at the uniform. It represented everything she had spent 10 years running away from. It represented hard work. It represented humility. It represented reality. She looked at the door. She thought about the world outside. She thought about the heat and the hunger and the shame. She looked back at me. She saw that I would not budge. She saw that the father who gave her everything was gone, and the boss was standing in his place. She stood up slowly. Her hands were shaking. She reached out. She took the gray bundle from my hands. The fabric was rough against her skin. She held it to her chest. She wiped her eyes. She took a deep breath. She said, thank you. She said, when do I start? I checked my watch. I said, shift starts at 10 tonight. I said, report to Sarah at the front desk. I said, she is your supervisor now. I said, do not be late. I said, we dock pay for tardiness. Nia nodded. She clutched the uniform like a life raft. She walked to the door. She stopped. She looked back at me. She wanted to say something else. She wanted to say she loved me. She wanted to say she would make me proud. I raised a hand. I said, save it, Nia. I said, show me. I said, words are cheap. I said, work is expensive. She opened the door. She walked out into the hallway. She walked toward the service elevator. She was barefoot and broken, but for the first time in her life, she was heading toward an honest day of work. I closed the door. I went back to the balcony. The sun was higher now. The day was bright. I took a sip of my coffee. It was cold, but it still tasted good. The lesson was taught. The family was broken, but the foundation was clean. Now we could see if anything worth saving could be built from the rubble. 6 months have passed since the night of the dinner. The seasons have changed in Miami, but the heat remains. It is a humid, sticky heat that clings to you. It reminds you that paradise has a price. I sit on the terrace of the penthouse suite. The sliding glass doors are open. The sound of the ocean crashing against the shore 50 floors below is a rhythmic comfort. It is the heartbeat of my empire. I pick up the newspaper from the glass table. It is folded open to the Metro section. There is a small article near the bottom of page 4. It details the sentencing of a local business executive for corporate embezzlement and fraud. Blake Anderson was sentenced yesterday. The judge was not lenient. The sheer volume of the theft and the arrogance of his defense offended the court. He received 5 years in federal prison. He will serve his time in a minimum security facility in the Panhandle. He will have plenty of time to think about his marketing strategies there. He will have time to think about the Wagyu beef he ordered and the bill he could not pay. I do not feel pity for him. He dug his hole with a golden shovel. Now he has to lie in it. Preston and Georgette faced their own reckoning. The foreclosure on their house was swift. My legal team does not make mistakes. They were evicted on a rainy Tuesday. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains as the movers set the Italian leather sofas on the curb. The rain ruined the silk upholstery. It was a poetic justice. They tried to sue me for emotional distress. No lawyer would take the case once they saw the loan documents. They had no leg to stand on. They live in a trailer park now. It is located 3 counties over near a water treatment plant. I hear the smell is quite pungent in the summer. Preston works as a greeter at a discount superstore. He has to wear a blue vest and smile at people he used to look down on. Georgette sells handmade beaded jewelry on the internet. She tells anyone who will listen that she was cheated out of her fortune by a vengeful relative. She clings to her victimhood like a lifeline. They learned the hard way that arrogance without money is just noise. They learned that when you strip away the leased cars and the country club memberships, there was nothing underneath but rot. I take a sip of my iced tea. I look down at the pool deck. I can see the staff moving like ants. They are setting up for the evening service. Among them is a figure in a gray uniform. It is Nia. She did not leave. She did not run after Blake. She showed up for her first shift at 10 o'clock that night, just as I instructed. She stood behind the front desk. She wore the polyester uniform. She checked guests in. She carried bags. She cleaned up a spill in the lobby when a child dropped a soda. She did it with tears in her eyes, but she did it. She lives in the staff dormitories in the basement. It is a small room with a twin bed and a shared bathroom. It is a far cry from the gated community. She eats in the employee cafeteria. She takes the bus to the laundromat. She is living the life I lived 40 years ago. Last week she received her first paycheck. It was for $600 after taxes. I watched her on the security feed. She held the check in her hands. She stared at it for a long time. She looked at it longer than she ever looked at the allowance I deposited in her blind trust. She did not spend it on shoes or a bag. She opened a savings account. She deposited $50. She is learning. We do not talk much yet. I am not ready to be her father again. I am her employer. When I pass her in the hallway, she stops. She stands against the wall. She nods her head. It is a nod of respect. It is a nod of acknowledgement. She knows now who holds the power. She knows that dignity is earned through sweat, not given through a credit card. She is building character one shift at a time. Perhaps one day she will be worthy of the legacy. Perhaps not. But for now, she is earning her keep. I turn my attention to the documents on the table in front of me. My lawyer brought them over this morning. They are printed on heavy bond paper. It is the charter for a new charitable organization. It is the Sarah King Foundation. I named it after my late wife, the woman who scrubbed floors so I could buy books, the woman who was accused of stealing a spoon by a woman like Georgette, the woman who never got to see the view from this penthouse. The foundation is simple. It provides full university scholarships for the children of service workers in the hospitality industry. It is for the children of the maids and the janitors and the cooks. It gives them a chance to rise without having to rely on the charity of fools. It gives them the ladder I had to build for myself. I take my gold fountain pen from my pocket. I unscrew the cap. The ink flows smoothly onto the paper. I sign my name, Reginald King. It is the most important signature of my life. It is my real legacy. The hotels will eventually crumble or be sold. The money will be spent. But this foundation will stand. It will change lives. It will ensure that no one else has to endure the humiliation I endured. I cap the pen. I place it on the table. I stand up and walk to the railing of the balcony. The wind is picking up. The sun is dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The lights of the resort flicker on one by one. It is a beautiful machine. It is a fortress. My family looked at me and saw a relic. They saw an old man in cheap clothes and assumed I was weak. They mistook my silence for senility. They mistook my kindness for frailty. They thought they could push me aside and take what they wanted. They were wrong. They forgot the most basic rule of nature. A lion does not need to roar to be dangerous. He just needs to bite. They thought I was a guest in their world. They did not realize I own the world they were trying to inhabit. I am not a washed-up old man. I am the landlord. I am the builder. I am the king in my castle. And a true king knows that his first duty is to protect the kingdom. He must protect it from enemies outside the gates and from traitors within the walls. I have cleaned house. The parasites are gone. The air is fresh. The ledger is balanced. I look out at the horizon. I breathe in the salt air. I feel strong. I feel alive. The vacation from reality is over. The work continues. And for the first time in a long time, I am looking forward to tomorrow. The lesson I learned is simple, but it cost me a lifetime to understand. I spent 40 years building an empire, but the most important thing I constructed was my self-respect. My family taught me a painful but necessary truth. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones most willing to bleed you dry. Never let anyone define your value by the clothes on your back or the silence you keep. True power is not about shouting the loudest. It is about holding the keys to the castle while everyone else is banging on the gates. Remember, respect is earned through character, not credit limits. If you have to buy your family's love, you are already bankrupt. If you enjoyed watching arrogance meet reality, hit that like button and subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to teach a tough lesson to someone who underestimated you?